Chapter 23 Hopes and Fears. Grinkers awoke from his sleep in a dreadful sweat. He had had another vivid dream, but this one had been dark and foreboding. He had seen his village being burned to the ground, his fellow elves fleeing for safety, and his friend Kris Kringle bound in heavy chains, unable to help. Grinkers took a moment to catch his breath from the nightmare. It had seemed so real, and it left a dark feeling within him that he could not shake. He arose from his bed, putting on his clothes and cap, and sat down at the desk where he wrote down his thoughts and recorded his visions. But as he grabbed his feather pen to write, he heard wild screams from above. He immediately ran up from his underground home to see what had caused the commotion, and before his very eyes was the scene from his dream. Grinkers wondered, that is, he hoped, that what he was witnessing now was simply a continuation of his nightmare. Perhaps he had never actually woken up. But as a fleeing elf knocked him to the ground accidentally, and smoke from the flames reached his nostrils, Grinkers knew this was all too real to only be in his head. He pushed himself off the ground and looked desperately for someone who could provide help. But all he could see were human soldiers on horseback, chasing the elves and throwing torches upon their houses and workshops. Most of the elves were fleeing for their lives, but some stood their ground and used their magic to try to prevent the spread of the fire. The screams of elves, the collapsing of burning wood and trees, and the neighing of overworked horses were the only sounds that Grinkers could hear, and it filled his heart with dread and fear. Suddenly, Felix was at his side, grabbing Grinkers by the arm and pulling him into a nearby bush for cover and concealment.
"Who are these men?"
Felix asked his leader with great concern. The two lay against the ground and watched as the hooves of horses and the armored feet of foot soldiers moved around them. They used their magic to turn themselves invisible to human eyes. "These men belong to a king," Grinkers said softly.
"Kris?"
Felix replied with shock. Grinkers shook his head. "No, this is not his doing. I dreamt of this very scenario moments before it happened, and I saw that our Kris Kringle was in as helpless a position as we."
"What do we do?"
Felix pleaded urgently.
"Elves are being dragged from their homes and taken away as prisoners."
Grinkers watched in horror as the elvish village was being left desolate. "We were not prepared for something like this," the old elf remarked sadly. "The reason for our moving to this forest was so that we would never have to be prepared for something like this. We cannot fight them, not successfully, not now. We must follow their horses to the place where our friends will be imprisoned. Perhaps then we can find a way to help them." The two waited as the royal soldiers finished their work and began to leave the village. When the last soldier had left, Felix and Grinkers exited their hiding spot and removed their invisibility. As they did so, they saw many other elves doing the same thing from their respective hiding spots. "How many were taken?" Grinkers called out to his elves. A head count was called for, and the elves were relieved to find that the vast majority of their race was able to hide and escape from the humans. An elf named Ernie handed a piece of paper to Grinkers. "Here are the names of the elves that are missing." "8 of them?" Grinkers confirmed as he read the list. Ernie nodded. Grinkers called for all the elves to assemble themselves together. "We do not know why these humans attacked and kidnapped our kind," Grinkers began. "I know some of you are probably fearful that our helping King Wenceslas and Kris Kringle is related to this incident. I am sure it is in some way. But we must not jump to conclusions. I sense that Kris Kringle is in as much trouble as our fellow elves who were captured. Let us follow the trail of their essence and find a way to rescue them."
"Who was captured?"
a voice called from the crowd. Grinkers read from the list. "Dancer, Comet, Dasher, Vixen, Donna, Blitzen, Prancer, and Cupid." After revealing to each other their secret identities as shepherds, Kris and Calvin shared all the information they knew in regards to King Renier. Kris learned that Calvin had been suspected of criminal activity when he was found traveling on the road between the green pasture and the village long after curfew. The first time he had been set free by a guard with a warning, but when he had returned from the shepherd's meeting in which it was decided he would meet Princess Ava in the marketplace, he was caught a second time and imprisoned for it. The two were trying to lift each other's spirits with talk of familiar things when both King Renier and Princess Ava descended the staircase into the dungeon. "Why don't you go in the cell with your boyfriend?" Renier told her, gesturing toward Kris's cell. "Give you lovebirds one last chance to say goodbye." He opened the cell door and pushed the princess inside. She fell into Kris's arms, who was standing there with great concern. What is the meaning of this? Chris asked Rainier angrily. What are you doing? Rainier held up Percy's parchment and smiled.
I hardly slept last night, he explained happily. I have been asking so many questions. Of course, I received some answers that I was not particularly pleased with, especially when I learned that one of the people most disloyal to me is my own sister. He glared at Ava, who had turned from embracing Chris to look back at her brother. Our father would be disgusted with the beast you've become, she spat out. If I cared at all for father, I wouldn't have done what I did and allowed your beloved to keep his robe. Wenceslas was a fool who tried to restrain my power and vision. He means nothing to me.
Rainier paused and looked over at Calvin.
You know, I held off with your execution because there was something about you that concerned me, but I could not put my finger on what it was until last night.
He looked at Chris and then back at Calvin.
The shepherds. The parchment revealed your secret brotherhood to me, trying to take over my kingdom. Such a waste of time and effort.
He looked out a small window on the far end of the dungeon, where a faint ray of the setting sun was coming through.
Tomorrow morning I will execute Kris Kringle in the public square, as a warning to any who would question my authority or betray my trust.
Ava gasped, but Chris stood firm. What will become of Ava? He asked the king.
Nothing, yet, he replied casually. In fact, as far as the people know, she will still be continuing on in her royal position. But I think I will keep her in this cell, where she will be forced day after day to think of her love and how he is no more. You're a monster, Ava cried out.
You won't get away with this, Calvin added sternly. Your power was given to you, and it can be taken away just the same.
No one can take my power, Rainier snarled. I will be invincible.
I couldn't help but notice you're missing some fingers there, Chris observed wryly, pointing to his injury. You can acquire all the power you want, Rainier, but even a king is not invincible.
We shall see, Rainier retorted with a knowing smile.
With that, he turned quickly and ascended the stairway, leaving the prisoners alone in fear.
He is invincible, Ava admitted. Or at least, he soon will be. You see, Percy's parchment was not the item he ultimately wanted. He needed it to find something else, something that would be even more dangerous in his hands.
What? Calvin asked impatiently.
He caught me spying on his conversation with Monty. That's when he brought me down here, she explained. I heard him say how he had asked the parchment for the location of the North Pole, an item that he said would finally grant him the power of immortality.
Where is this North Pole located? Chris asked her.
I am not sure exactly. I heard him say it was not too far from here, past the green pasture and Pinetop Mountains.
Chris sat down in defeat. Then he will have it soon enough, he mourned. For the next several hours of the night, the three of them sat there in their prison, each thinking of some way to escape and stop Rainier. Chris had suggested that Paul might come to their rescue, since he worked in the castle, but Ava reminded him that Rainier now knew of Paul's identity as a shepherd, and would have seen to it that he was banned from the castle, if not imprisoned. Silverbell is lost, Calvin finally decided with a soft voice that was choked with emotion. There may still be hope, Chris countered. If the other shepherds have done their part, the people now know who Rainier really is. Perhaps with enough support. It won't make a difference, Chris, Calvin argued. It's done. If he finds this North Pole, all will be lost. But even if he doesn't, you're still dead in the morning, with me and the princess not far behind.
We can't give up, though, Ava urged. Like Chris said, it's not just us who are fighting for Silverbell. We must hold on tight to any ray of hope there is left. Hope is the key.
Chris sighed as he placed his forehead against the bars of the cell. His sad eyes suddenly widened as he saw a most unusual sight before him. Floating down the staircase, just above the ground, was a brass key. It flew through the air and stopped right in front of Chris.
Hope is the key,
a disembodied voice repeated. A smile appeared on Chris's face, for he immediately recognized the small, high-pitched voice he was hearing. Removing his invisibility, Felix now stood visible to all, the brass key to the prison cell in his hand.
And the key is hope,
he said with a grin.